From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Whenever the government faces a whistleblower that is revealing some kind of wrongdoing that makes them uncomfortable, that implicates them in some kind of activity they should not be doing, they are going to try and change the conversation from the concrete harms of their actions, of their policies in government.
As a whistleblower complaint against President Trump rocks Washington, Democrats begin an impeachment inquiry, and Trump threatens big consequences for the person who came forward. We bring you part 2 of our conversation with one of the world's most famous whistleblowers, Edward Snowden, now in exile in Russia. 6 years ago, he shocked the world when he leaked a trove of secret documents about how the United States had built a massive surveillance apparatus to collect every single phone call, text message, and email, and pry into the private lives of every person on Earth. Snowden has just published a memoir. It's called Permanent Record.
Every level of government had been in on the violation of our constitutional rights. And so they created an entirely different document that basically said, oh, don't worry about it, nothing to see here.
We spend the hour with NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Democratic-led House is quickly moving ahead with its impeachment inquiry of President Trump for abusing his power for personal gain after an intelligence whistleblower revealed Trump had pressed the president of Ukraine to investigate his political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. On Sunday, House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff revealed the anonymous whistleblower will soon testify before the committee.
We are taking all the precautions we can to make sure that we do so. We allow that testimony to go forward in a way that protects the whistleblower's identity because, as you can imagine, with the president issuing threats like we ought to treat these people who expose my wrongdoing as we used to treat traitors and spies and we used to execute traitors and spies, you can imagine the security concerns here.
On Saturday, lawyers for the whistleblower wrote a letter to the chairs of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees expressing fears for their client's safety after President Trump compared the whistleblower to a treasonous spy and demanded to, quote, meet my accuser. The lawyers wrote, quote, the events of the past week have heightened our concerns that our client's identity will be disclosed publicly and that as a result, our client will be put in harm's way, they said. Over the weekend, President Trump repeatedly took to Twitter to attack the whistleblower as well as a range of officials and journalists. He accused Chairman Schiff of committing treason. He described Schiff and a group of other Democratic lawmakers as savages. He claimed impeachment is unlawful. And he reposted a message from a supporter warning impeachment could lead to a, quote, civil war-like fracture in this nation. Republican Congressmember Adam Kinzinger of Illinois tweeted, Trump's Civil War retweet was, quote, beyond repugnant. Congressmember Kinzinger wrote, quote, I have visited nations ravaged by civil war. Real Donald Trump, I have never imagined such a quote to be repeated by a president. In other developments related to the impeachment inquiry, 3 House committees have subpoenaed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to turn over documents related to the administration's dealings with Ukraine. This comes as Trump and former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani are facing accusations they ran a shadow foreign policy in Ukraine outside of normal channels. But on Sunday, Giuliani insisted Pompeo was aware of what was happening. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's special envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker, has resigned. More than 2 million people took to the streets in a massive global climate strike Friday. From Bangladesh to Uganda to Chile, demonstrators walked out of work or school to demand world leaders act to solve the climate crisis. 1 million people protested throughout Italy alone. In Montreal, Canada, 600,000 people joined the strike, including Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish climate activist who sparked the Fridays for Future movement.
This week, world leaders all around the world, from all around the world, gathered in New York for the UN Climate Action Summit. They disappointed us once again with their empty words and insufficient plans. We told them to unite behind the science, but they didn't listen. So today, we are millions around the world, striking and marching again, and we will keep on doing it until they listen.
The protests followed the September 20th global demonstration that brought more than 4 million people into the streets. 350.org founder Bill McKibben called the week of protests almost certainly the largest demonstration our planet has yet seen about climate change. In related news, nearly 70 climate activists were arrested Saturday in New Hampshire after marching onto a coal power plant to demand an end to fossil fuel use. They were part of a group of hundreds attempting to shut down Merrimack Station, one of the largest coal-fired power plants in all of New England. In immigration news, a federal judge has blocked a Trump administration rule that would have allowed the government to indefinitely detain migrant children and their families. California Judge Dolly G. ruled Friday that the proposed policy violated the 1997 Flores Agreement, which caps the jailing of migrant children and families to 20 days. She called Trump's proposed rule change Kafkaesque. A federal judge blocked another Trump-era immigration policy in Washington, D.C. Friday, ruling against new regulations seeking to fast-track deportations without a fair legal process. Voters in Afghanistan went to the polls Saturday, but voter turnout may have hit a record low. Preliminary data shows around a quarter of the country's registered voters took part in the election, which pitted Afghanistan's chief executive Abdullah Abdullah against Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. Abdullah Abdullah is already claiming victory, even though official results won't be announced for another 3 weeks. The BBC reports at least 5 people were killed in attacks on voting stations, another 80 wounded. The prominent Egyptian dissident, Alaa Abdel Fattah, has been arrested again, and a growing crackdown on anti-government protesters. Abdel Fattah was arrested Sunday as he was preparing to leave an Egyptian police station where he's been forced to sleep at night since being freed in March after serving a 5-year prison sentence. A lawyer representing Abdel Fattah was also arrested. Egyptian authorities have arrested more than 2,000 people amidst an outbreak of anti-government protests. Alaa Abdel Fattah was a leader of the 2011 uprising against Hosni Mubarak. He spoke to Democracy Now! In 2014.
So they are on a sentencing frenzy. I mean, this is not just about me. And it's almost as if it's a war on a whole generation.
To see our recent coverage of the crackdown in Egypt, visit democracynow.org. Houthi rebels in Yemen are claiming to have killed 500 Saudi soldiers and captured thousands more during a major attack into Saudi Arabia in August. While the Houthis released video of the reported incident on Sunday, news outlets have yet to verify the claims. The Spanish newspaper El País has revealed the CIA worked with a Spanish private security company to spy on WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he had sought political asylum. Assange lived in the embassy from 2012 until April, when he was arrested by British authorities. Ecuador had hired the firm Undercover Global to protect the embassy, but the firm reportedly also secretly handed over audio and video to the CIA of meetings Assange had with his lawyers and others. The firm installed secret video cameras inside the embassy and placed microphones in the embassy's fire extinguishers and in the women's bathroom. The head of the firm is now being investigated by Spain's National Court. To see our series of interviews with Julian Assange when he had political exile in the embassy, you can go to democracynow.org. Workers at General Motors have entered their 3rd week on strike. It's the longest national strike the United Auto Workers has had in nearly half a century at GM, which earned nearly $35 billion over the past 3 years. Workers are seeking higher pay, protection of their health care benefits, greater job security, and a commitment from GM to build more products in the United States. And former U.S. Ambassador Joseph Wilson has died at the age of 69 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In 2003, he openly challenged President George W. Bush's claim that Iraq was trying to buy uranium from Niger, a claim the administration used to justify the invasion of Iraq. Wilson had been sent to Niger by the administration to investigate the claim in 2002, but found no such evidence. Despite Wilson's findings, the uranium allegation was included in Bush's 2003 State of the Union address claim that Saddam Hussein was obtaining weapons of mass destruction. Shortly after Wilson wrote a Washington Post op-ed, the Bush administration helped out Wilson's then-wife, Valerie Plame, as a covert CIA operative. They outed her. In 2004, Joseph Wilson appeared on Democracy Now!
The title of my piece is What I Did Not Find in Africa, and what it cataloged was a trip out to Niger at the request of the CIA, acting in response to a question by the Vice President, to check out allegations that Iraq had attempted to purchase significant quantities of uranium from that country. Now, it was a very important question because, after all, Iraq would have only one use for uranium. That would be nuclear weapons programs, and that would have been the one piece of incontrovertible evidence that he was attempting to reconstitute nuclear weapons programs, which would have lent some credence to the notion that the smoking gun might be a mushroom cloud. I came back. I said there was nothing to this.
To see our full interview with the late Joseph Wilson, visit democracynow.org. His ex-wife, Valerie Plame, is now running for Congress in New Mexico. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the Democratic-led House moves swiftly towards impeachment, President Trump took to Twitter Sunday night to attack the whistleblower whose complaint first exposed his dealings with Ukraine. In a series of tweets, including one threatening civil war if impeachment proceedings move forward, President Trump accused the unnamed whistleblower of spying on the president, promising, quote, big consequences. Well, today we bring you part 2 of our conversation with one of the world's most famous whistleblowers, Edward Snowden. 6 years ago, the 29-year-old Ed Snowden leaked a trove of secret documents about how the United States had built a massive surveillance apparatus to collect every single phone call, text message, and email and pry into the private lives of every person on Earth. In May 2013, Ed Snowden quit his job as a National Security Administration contractor in Hawaii and flew to Hong Kong, where he met 3 reporters, Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and Ewan McCaskill, who began publishing a series of articles exposing the NSA and the surveillance state. Snowden was then charged in the United States with violating the Espionage Act and other laws. In order to avoid being extradited to the United States, he attempted to fly from Hong Kong to Latin America, transiting through Moscow. But Snowden became stranded in Russia after the U.S. revoked his passport. Russia then granted him political exile, and he's lived in Moscow ever since. Ed Snowden has just published a memoir. It's called Permanent Record. It tells the story of what led him to risk his life to expose the U.S. government's system of mass surveillance. Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to him from his home in Moscow last week. We talked about his book, his work as an intelligence contractor, the ongoing debate about privacy rights online, and the latest news from Washington. Juan asked Ed Snowden about the role contractors play in the intelligence community.
Throughout the book, one of the themes that you hit on repeatedly is how the government initially attempted to say that you were just an outside contractor, that you really weren't a key figure. But the reality is, as you explain and document over and over again, the enormous reliance of our intelligence community and the federal government on outside contractors to effectively bring them into government and give them enormous power and rely on them so dramatically. I'm wondering if you could expound on that.
Congress has mandated the government have hard hiring caps, a specific headcount they can't exceed for certain executive agencies like the CIA, like the NSA, no matter their particularized budget, right? If they have more dollars than people, they still can't get more people on the books without getting an act of Congress to sort of change that headcount. And so over the years, over the decades that have really arisen out of the post-World War II era, we have in the government created a kind of new system, a runaround for this, where they go, well, all of this extra money that we want to put in people, but we can't bring on as formal government employees, what if we give that money to private companies? And the private companies lease us people that in all meaningful ways are government employees. They work in government facilities, as I did as a contractor. You're at an NSA desk working on an NSA system. You're taking direction from an NSA government supervisor working on government processes. But formally, legally, you work for Dell or Lockheed Martin or Booz Allen Hamilton or any one of these really thousands and thousands of private companies that have become really extensions of government. And this is one of the things that the book goes into detail and that people really aren't quite familiar with. A significant amount, and potentially even a small majority, of the most important work in government, in intelligence, is today performed by contractors, not government employees. And this is because in the actual contracting language, there are very, very few tasks that contractors are legally forbidden from doing. And it's basically the only things contractors can't do is press the red button that fires a missile, right? The contractor is not supposed to actually commit a crime, something that the government could do and it wouldn't be a crime, but if a private company does, they could be sued by another state or whatever. But everything else, building the system of mass surveillance, installing it, applying it, using it to gather or search through all this information that's already been collected to build perfect histories of private lives. All of these things are fair game and are done routinely every day, right now, by people who are not formally government employees. That's how the system works, and that's what a contractor is.
Well, and I want to get to that point, though, when the realization of what you were participating in came to you. This was sometime after a report had come out on the unclassified report on the president's surveillance program in July of 2009, and it had been released by several inspector generals of the major defense agencies, and you were by then already what's known either as systems administrator, systems engineer. Most people don't realize that the most important person in any organization or business are the people who run the computer systems, because they have enormous access to communications, the email communications, and all kinds of other documents. So you were operating, and a report comes across your desk that is actually the unclassified version of that same report, and you discover that it is completely different from what the unclassified version was. And you say in the book, this was about the Stellar Wind project, and you say that the program's very existence was an indication that the agency's mission had been transformed from using technology to defend America to using technology to control it by redefining citizens' private internet communications as signals intelligence. Do you talk about that some more?
Yeah, that's correct. So for people who are interested in getting the bare facts on this, this is, I think, a especially useful example and a big part of the book. Because it's been published, the classified report, the very classified report, the Inspector General's report, into what is effectively the Bush-era warrantless wiretapping program, an internet surveillance program, which was not known to the public at the time, even in the wake of the initial reporting, has been published in the Washington Post. If you search for stellar wind, stellar like stars and wind like we all know, as one word, and Washington Post, you can find the classified Inspector General's report and read it yourself. And this showed an incredibly detailed tick-tock history of how it was that at the direction of the President of the United States, and with the knowledge and awareness of only a few key members in Congress, The work of the United States government and the intelligence agencies was intentionally, knowingly violating the Constitution of the United States on a daily basis. This was a systemic effort that was not a one-off. What I saw was this Inspector General, or actually all of the Inspector Generals of the intelligence community, had produced a report on the Bush-era warrantless wiretapping program in the wake of the scandal, when the story first broke in December of 2005, and it led to reforms of law. It led to a ton of panicked congressmen and, of course, the president, who were all implicated in this wrongdoing. And what they were actually doing was trying to paper over all of the laws they had broken by passing new laws that retroactively made what they did okay. And so at the very end of this process, they put out an unclassified report. Now, as almost everyone knows now, thanks to things like the Mueller report and so on, the government will routinely provide classified documents to the public by redacting them. It's the same document, but it's got, these blacked out sections where you can't see this name or this detail or this program, whatever. What struck me so much about the division between the unclassified report and the classified report was they were entirely different documents. And I encourage the audience to compare these for yourselves. And what this meant was the actual truth of what the government was doing was so problematic that they could not declassify, they could not summarize, they could not redact without indicating that basically every level of government had been in on the violation of our constitutional rights. And so they created an entirely different document that basically said, oh, don't worry about it, nothing to see here. And this is the challenge when we talk about proper channels, when we talk about inspectors generals, when we talk about congressional oversight. These processes only work when the harm that you are reporting, the people who are responsible for it are willing to correct. So if it's a little bad, maybe it'll work. If it involves one person who the rest of the elite section are willing to sacrifice, or in fact very much want to get rid of, then yes, these kind of oversight processes can work. But if what you are reporting is that all of the different branches of government are working in concert to violate the rights of the American people, what do you think they're going to do when that report comes across their desk? They're going to get rid of you. They're going to bury what you have reported, and very possibly they're going to put you in prison.
And you mentioned earlier the cloud, and that you were helping to get many of the documents of, I think it was the CIA, into a cloud where any CIA agent anywhere could access those records, but the cloud computing is not really in the clouds. It's usually a farm, a data farm, a huge data farm somewhere in an obscure part of the country. And you mentioned at a point at which I think it was Amazon got a huge contract from the NSA to build one of these cloud farms. And you note that this is not only a question of creating a permanent record that these government spy agencies are doing, but they're also trying to create a permanent record of everything, and not just in the U.S., but around the world. Talk about that.
Right. So when people hear the word cloud today, if they're not technical, we sort of generally have an understanding maybe of what it means, but as you say, it's sort of abstract. Cloud simply means other people's computers. And the Amazon cloud contract that you're talking about, I actually describe in the book, I was directly competing at Dell against Amazon's bid to build a private cloud for the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community. And this is this new method of handling data where all of our records of our lives, your pictures, your emails, are typically no longer actually held by you. They're held by Google. And you log into your account, to your Gmail or whatever, and Google says, oh, here's your emails. You want to look at these? And then when you log off, they keep them. The benefit of this is you can log in from another device and see the same emails, but it also means they can give these emails to anyone that they want, and they have and did and continue to give these to governments, not just our government, but other governments. And of course, corporations and advertisers through different ways. They'll say they don't, and legally, in some ways, they're correct in the strictest sense. But the reality is, the memories that we love the most, the connections that make us who we are, that comprise our families, that form our communities, are controlled by people who do not even see us as customers because we are not paying them. Governments, advertisers, other groups, those are their customers. We are the product. And so, what we saw in this context is the whole internet was moving from this 1990s model of the internet where everybody had their own computer. We had our own data, we connected things, and we shared things one-to-one. We sent a link to this person, we pushed a file to this person, we put something on a floppy disk. Remember floppy disks? And we gave it to a friend. Instead, now, all of our terminals became phones, right? They became client devices that were dependent on these larger central servers, right? Data centers. And the only people who ran these data centers, who could control and understand these data centers, were almost a sort of new priesthood, right? These are the only ones who could speak the language of technology, who could control these systems. They became more complex, and we, average people, increasingly became disempowered and dependent on these companies to the point where we didn't really have an alternative. This shift in the way our systems work is what is creating, I think, fundamentally, the creeping authoritarianism that we see today. People have all of these arguments about the left and the right, but what we see, sadly, in many parts of government, and not just in the United States, but around the world, in places like the UK, Poland, Hungary, we see a growing authoritarianism where the left and the right have sharp disagreements on a few particular points, typically about social policy. But broadly, they're actually gravitating on the north-south part of the political axis, not left or right, but towards authoritarianism rather than the libertarianism from which this country was born, rather than a government of enumerated powers that has very strict limits on what it can and can't do. Instead, we have governments where they go, we need to do this for X justification. And so long as the justification is persuasive enough, the public will permit it, or in many cases, support it. But you have to remember that in this country, there have always been limits on what the government can do. Even if they want to, even if there is public support, the reason we have the Constitution is not to protect the majority, it's to protect the minority from the majority. And that is beginning to change, and corporations are very much beginning to act as deputies of government as they influence, or they hold more influence in society, and begin to occupy quasi-governmental roles, such as regulating the things that can and cannot be said on the internet.
We're spending the hour with National Security Agency whistleblower Edward Snowden. His new memoir, Permanent Record. Back with him in a minute.
Hold tight. We're in for
Burning down the House by talking heads. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue part 2 of our conversation with NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, who's just published his memoir. It's called Permanent Record. Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to him from his home in Moscow last week, where he's lived in exile since 2013. Ed Snowden talked about how he worked at the NSA's Office of Information Sharing, an office of one, him.
What does the Office of Information Sharing do? Well, besides me being way better at that job than the NSA ever thought that I would be, much to their dismay, think about the director of an agency, right? Think about the head of a unit. Think about someone who's supposed to know all the secrets to everything. They're not technologists, and these are very technical systems. When they say, I need to know what's going on with this, or show me this program, somebody has to get that, right? They don't know how to get it themselves. And that means somebody has all the accesses these directors have, all of these other things. These people are called systems administrators. And so I was sitting for the first time in my career, really, with absolute awareness, not of the little picture, but the big picture, how all the pieces fit together. And I created a system called the Heartbeat. This is a new technological platform. You can think of it like a news aggregator, the landing page, on Google News that pulls from all of these different newspapers and says, here's what's interesting for you based on who you are, whatever. And it would go, this person works in this office, they should see these kind of programs. And I created a kind of crude proof of concept system to do this. But a byproduct of this meant that I now was sitting on top of a mountain of secrets. And it turned out that a lot of those secrets were criminal. So now I had to find a way to collect the evidence of wrongdoing, get it out of one of the most highly secured buildings on the planet. It was a World War II era airplane factory that was buried under a pineapple field. That was later converted into a spy base in Hawaii, and somehow get it to journalists without getting caught. And this is really where we get into the climax of the book.
Ed, at this point, you also discuss that you at first considered going to WikiLeaks, but then changed your mind because of some changes in WikiLeaks policy that also you felt you could not in good conscience participate in. If you could talk about that as well.
Right. So a lot of people misread this and think of it as me sort of denouncing WikiLeaks, and it's not. I think some of the reporting that WikiLeaks has done is tremendously important, both for the historic record and also for contemporary politics. Basically every story that they've run in the last many years, and of course this, when we're talking about is in 2013, it's long before the 2016 election, has been covered by newspapers around the world. But what had happened in the wake of the 2009 Manning disclosures, this is where WikiLeaks published the collateral murder video of U.S. helicopter pilots killing not just a journalist, but also the first responders that came to their aid, and the classified histories of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the State Department's diplomatic cables that in some ways are argued to have sort of helped spark or at least catalyze the Arab Spring movement. What had happened is in the early parts of WikiLeaks reporting, they worked in concert with newspapers, with sort of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, major newspapers. But at some point, one of the journalists that they had worked with wrote a memoir or some kind of book where they published the password that Julian Assange had given them to the entire archive of data that only journalists were supposed to have, not the public. Because the journalists were supposed to go through this process of deciding what in this archive of material does the public need to know and what is a legitimate secret that maybe there's no benefit for publishing. Once this journalist published this, WikiLeaks went, well, all of the bad guys in the world, basically, have access to this material because the archive, encrypted archive, was available to anyone. It's just you needed the password to unlock it. And now this bonehead journalist had published it and basically unlocked Pandora's box. WikiLeaks was in a tough place there, and they basically revised their editorial policy to go, you know what, we're going to publish everything pristine and unredacted so that everyone is on a common footing. Whether you're a good guy or a bad guy, at least we all have access to the same information. It's not my place to agree or disagree with that, say it's right or wrong. But what I did want to do was try a different model. What happens? Is there a difference? Because Chelsea Manning, of course, was accused of all the same things that I was. Said, this person's a traitor, said this person endangered the troops, which has never borne out, by the way. We're now more than 10 years on from those activities. And the government, even at Chelsea Manning's trial, after they've convicted her, the government was invited by the judge to show evidence of harm, and they couldn't show anyone was harmed as a result of disclosures. But could these accusations of government be mitigated by the process of whistleblowing? Could we simply be more discriminating? Could we be overly cautious? Could we accommodate to the maximum extent what the government thought would be an appropriate process while still empowering journalists? And this was the model that I set out to try and prove. Can we have myself, any whistleblower, right, gather evidence of wrongdoing and trust that to the press under the condition that the journalists agree they will publish no story simply because it's newsworthy, simply because it's interesting, but only publish stories they are willing to make an institutional judgment are in the public interest to know. And then as an extraordinary check beyond that, go to the government in advance of publication, warn the government we're about to publish this story, and give the government an adversarial opportunity to argue against this. Say this will cause harm, someone will get hurt, redact this detail. And in all cases I'm aware of, that process was followed. And this is why in 2019, I think it's so obvious that no harm to national security has resulted from this process of disclosure. And yet, the same criticisms, the same allegations are made to me as have been every other whistleblower. And what we need to understand here is not my model of publication is right and WikiLeaks' model is wrong, but rather to see you have two very different levels of caution, right, of risk mitigation in these publication models. And yet, despite years and years of investigation by the most powerful government in history, in neither case has the government ever established or even offered evidence of harm as a result of this disclosure. And so this is the fundamental point that I just want to summarize for people. Whenever the government faces a whistleblower that is revealing some kind of wrongdoing that makes them uncomfortable, that implicates them in some kind of activity they should not be doing, they are going to try and change the conversation from the concrete harms of their actions, of their policies in government, and instead try to have a discussion about the theoretical risks of journalism in a free and open society. And of course, there are risks to having a free press. But we embrace those risks because those are the things that guarantee we are truly free.
Your decisions to eventually provide the information to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and how those meetings initially went?
Yeah, so I have to work with journalists to get them interested in meeting with someone who they don't even know their name, right? Because if I give the journalists my name and they mishandle it because the government is spying on everyone, I know how the mass surveillance system works, the government will have me in jail before anybody knows anything. So I have to go through this elaborate process of trying to reach out to journalists, convince them to use encrypted communications, while protecting myself from mass surveillance, driving around Hawaii with a specialized system that's basically a GPS magnet that I can attach to the roof of my car, run through the window by wire to a laptop, which has an enormously powerful antenna connected to it, and then basically create a map using that antenna of everywhere there are different wireless access points that are either open and unlocked or vulnerable to being unlocked by me that I can use for this covert communications in a way that won't lead back to me. And then I have to convince them, I know something serious that you need to know about, the public needs to know about. But I can't tell you what it is yet until you do this. Then get them online, then begin showing them evidence, and then ultimately get them to meet. And this was a tremendously stressful period that's covered in some detail in the book. But I think it is extraordinary, and I think these journalists should be all applauded for the risks that they took. Because it's very likely they could have been meeting with somebody who was saying, oh, you know, I've got the biggest secret in the world. The aliens have landed, and they work in the State Department. But they came, and they looked at the documents. They took them seriously. They authenticated them. And eventually they won the Pulitzer Prize for public service journalism because of that.
And after you met with them and you shared your stories and they were writing them as you were meeting together in Hong Kong, describe what it meant to go underground there and then to ultimately how you made your way, ended up at the Moscow airport and couldn't leave once you got there.
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. So I had been looking at this entire reporting system as a crazy system of a series of challenges that were becoming increasingly difficult. But the end of it, the finish line was you've delivered the secret to journalists, that the government has violated the rights of Americans and the Constitution of the United States. They can then publish that information, and that was the end of the process, because I was always planning on getting arrested. And so then when the story comes out, and my biggest fear was this was going to be a 2-day story that everybody stopped talking about, it just blew over, the government sort of suppressed it. It became the biggest story on the planet that year. Suddenly, everybody was interested in me. The government made me public enemy number one. I was the most wanted man in the world. It was a question of, all right, what now? And I didn't really have an idea. So I talked with journalists, I talked with lawyers that were introduced to me by the journalists, human rights lawyers, and tried to plan my next stage. I talked to the United Nations, and ultimately, the United Nations came back and went, this is sort of, they wouldn't say this publicly, and I wouldn't encourage them to go on the record about this. But they went, look, practically the U.S. has enormous sway in our organization. They pay an enormous amount of our budget, and the U.S. gets what the U.S. wants. We probably can't help you. We will try. But it's likely to work out to your disadvantage. And so if the UN can't protect you, who can? And my lawyer, Robert Thibault, had this idea that I would go underground with the refugee families that he had been representing that were themselves trying to seek asylum in Hong Kong. And so suddenly I've gone from staying in a 5-star hotel with journalists to staying in an apartment shared by 5 people, where the kitchen is the bathroom, and the entire thing is smaller than most suburban bathrooms. And I'm trying to communicate with journalists, and these people were so brave. I still can't believe, I'm in disbelief that they just welcomed me in when my face was on the front page of every newspaper. But they knew what it was like to be hunted by a government for having done the right thing. They were escaping violence and persecution. And they were just trying to make their way through the world. And this is the thing that always strikes me. They had nothing. These were the most vulnerable people on the planet. But it's the people who have nothing that care about others the most, because all they have are connections. And so I've been an aggressive advocate since then for trying to get them resettled. We have resettled 2 of them, a mother and her daughter, in Canada after years and years of effort. But unfortunately, the Trudeau government is still digging in their heels and trying to prevent the rest of the families from entering into asylum. In Hong Kong, the number of people who have their asylum claims approved is less than 1%, which is actually those are some of the worst figures in the world for that. And even if they get their asylum claims granted, they are forced to be resettled in third countries rather than in Hong Kong itself.
NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, he tells his story in his new book, Permanent Record, back in 30 Seconds with Snowden.
Qué triste fue decirnos adiós cuando nos adorábamos más. Hasta la golondrina emigró, presagiando el final.
El Triste, by one of Latin America's most beloved singers, José José, known as the Prince of Song. He passed away in South Florida Saturday at the age of 71. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we conclude our interview with NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, who's just published his memoir, Permanent Record. Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to him last week and asked him to describe how he arrived in Moscow, where he now lives.
Ultimately, it's a question of, as the U.S. government continues to apply pressure, where do you go? The Chinese government is probably unlikely to intervene. They don't want any part of this. The Hong Kong government, as we just described, is not exactly a beacon of human rights itself. And their courts are unlikely to adjudicate the process fairly in the face of historic U.S. pressure. So you have to look at what country will be able to protect someone who's standing on principle. And in this case, at this moment, Ecuador was trying to take a real freedom of speech, freedom of the press perspective. They had famously, of course, welcomed Julian Assange into their embassy. And unfortunately, they have since reversed that decision and delivered him to the British police. So I tried to go to Ecuador. What this meant, if you look at the flight maps, is there's no direct flight from Hong Kong to Latin America. Or at least to Ecuador, rather, that does not cross U.S. airspace, which would be a dangerous thing to do for someone in my position. So you got to go the long way around, and that means going through non-extradition countries. So I have to build an air bridge over the flight path, which goes from Hong Kong to Russia, Russia to Cuba, Cuba to Venezuela, and then from Venezuela to Bolivia, or Bolivia to Ecuador, Venezuela to Ecuador. And that's what I did. Now, as soon as I left the airport in Hong Kong, we had gone wheels up. There are press conferences being called by the Secretary of State, then John Kerry, and he canceled my passport, which meant that when I landed in Russia, I could no longer leave. I couldn't board my onward flight. I'm stopped at passport control. I'm intercepted by security and led into this business lounge, right? And I knew this was coming because I worked for the CIA, worked for the NSA. I had training on what it's like when governments interfere with your travel. But I had prepared for this. Prior to leaving Hong Kong, because I knew I would have to go through all of these different countries, I destroyed my access to the archive. It had been provided to journalists, and now I had no way of recovering it. I didn't know any passwords. I didn't have any data. There was nothing I could do to assist these governments. And this is not, you don't have to think about this, we love and trust Ed Snowden. Think about it in terms of self-preservation. If you know something that's of such extraordinary value to any intelligence service, they might consider actually torturing you. Obviously, that would be dangerous for them because I'm the most famous person in the world. Somebody's going to ask what happened to him. But, then they can just push me off a building afterwards and go, I guess the CIA found him. So the only way to be safe was to not have anything of value. But I get intercepted nonetheless, which I anticipated would likely be the case. And I walk into this room, and there's these different guys in basically identical suits. And as soon as this older gentleman starts talking, I know exactly what he is because I worked at the CIA and seen these guys over and over again. He's what we call a case officer. when people think of intelligence, they think of like James Bond. They think that's what a spy is. But the reality is almost every spy, as we would think about them, who works for the U.S. intelligence service or any other ones, is actually just a normal guy who works out of an embassy under the cover of a diplomat. And his job is not to spy himself. His job is to talk other people into spying. We call this recruiting assets. And the assets themselves, those are the actual spies. The other guy just meets with them and writes down what they say. So these guys say, I regret to inform you your passport has been canceled. After they ask me preliminary questions about, like, where are you going? What are you doing? You want to stay in Russia? And I go, no, I'm planning to go onward. And I know they already know this because, of course, I'm flying on a Russian airline, so they're going to have the passenger manifest. And when he says your passport's been canceled, the first thing I think is this is a trick. My government would not be that stupid because you have to understand from the U.S. perspective, if they think I'm actually a traitor, if they think I'm actually likely to help a foreign government, Russia is the last place on earth they would want me to be, right? And I don't think the government's that stupid. So instead, they know, the U.S. government, which is getting passenger manifests from around the world, knows that I'm en route to Ecuador. Why wouldn't they just let me continue to Ecuador, where it would be much easier for the CIA to operate than in Russia? But I go and I check the internet with a witness, Sarah Harrison, a journalist who's with me, precisely so I can't be isolated.
And Sarah, of course, was with WikiLeaks. And did Julian Assange help you in getting that ticket from Hong Kong to Russia? I mean, no, from Hong Kong beyond, so that you could make that journey, that escape?
Right. No. So this is actually, there's a lot of confusion about this. People are like, Julian Assange, arranged asylum for me in Russia and all of these conspiracy theories. It's completely untrue. Assange was helpful. WikiLeaks was helpful, and Sarah Harrison especially was helpful. But the things WikiLeaks as an organization did had nothing to do with Russia. Again, it was never the plan to be in Russia. He talked to the Ecuadorian consul in the embassy where he was trapped and got him to sign an emergency document, the kind of safe passage document that they were used so prominently in World War II. Unfortunately, this was an unofficial document because they broke protocol. It didn't really have any legal meaning. But the man who signed this, Fidel Narvaez, is an extraordinarily brave man. And having that document is in a real way, even though it didn't have legal force, was what gave me the confidence, the courage to get on that plane to begin the journey. So yes, when the whole thing about, Julian Assange sort of masterminded me being in Russia, which I think is actually the question that a lot of people have there, is simply untrue.
But not Russia, but helped you to leave Hong Kong so that you could make it to the destination you were hoping for. At the time, wasn't it also true that President Morales' plane was brought down right in Austria because the U.S. government thought that you might be on board his flight from Bolivia?
Yeah, this is precisely correct. The chronology is a little bit different, but it is correct. So what happens is I leave Hong Kong. I get trapped in Russia. These guys pitch me, and this, for those who are interested in the book, this is an entire chapter. It's laid out in detail. I refused them. Because I'm not going to cooperate with any intelligence service anymore. And I'm worried that there's a tape recorder under the table recording this, and they're going to use this to try to compromise me, to try to manipulate me. So I go, look, I don't have anything. I'm not going to help you guys. I'll be fine on my own. If you want to search my bag, it's right here. Of course, I'm saying this as politely as possible because I don't want any more enemies. And they go, are you sure? Are you sure there's not any little thing that you can do, because life is going to be very difficult for someone in your position without friends? And actually, Sarah stopped him and said, "No, thanks. We'll be fine." And I will always admire her courage. But so now, because I wouldn't cooperate with the Russian intelligence services, I'm trapped in an airport that I can't leave, and I spend the next 40 days in this airport, applying for asylum to countries around the world. And this is where the Morales incident that you mentioned comes into play. Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, has been asked about my situation, and he said, of course, Mr. Snowden is defending human rights around the world. This guy's not a criminal, and he should be protected. It's not Bolivia's problem, but, if he were in Bolivia, maybe. And he had been traveling to Moscow for an energy conference there. And as his plane left, there was a rumor that I was on board the plane. And so Europe closed its airspace to his presidential aircraft, which is an extraordinary violation of international law that's unprecedented. Like, can you imagine Air Force One being grounded with the U.S. president on it? And they wouldn't let it leave. It was forced to make an emergency landing in Austria until the U.S. ambassador was able to walk through the plane with the Bolivian president to prove that I wasn't on board. Of course, this was an extraordinary insult to the whole of Latin America. They were furious about this. And it's after this moment, it's after the U.S. went too far, where finally Russia let me out of the airport. And I think it was because it had just become such a distracting spectacle that was now affecting Russia's international relations. The reality is we will probably never know what the Russian government's actual thinking is unless they start writing far more forthcoming memoirs than I think any of us expect. But when you look at that situation, my suspicion is that they realized, given Russia's problematic human rights record, this is a rare opportunity for them to do basically nothing and yet to end up doing the right thing for the world.
Your thoughts, Edward Snowden, on President Trump?
I've said before, Donald Trump strikes me as nothing so much as a man who has never known a love that he hasn't had to pay for. And I think that forms all of his decision-making. I think that explains all of the things that we see. This is someone who sees the world through a prism of a very, very sad lens, which is that what he is, who he is, does not today and never has and never will have any value. The only thing that matters is what he has, what he can trade. And I think that really explains all of the transactional corruption that we have seen throughout this administration, is simply someone who thinks that's what life is.
And finally, your thoughts on President Obama, because your trials and tribulations, maybe not trial yet, actually occurred through the Obama years.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's tremendously unpopular, I think, even still today, for anybody to say a bad word about Obama. Because on balance, when you look at a lot of the things that came out of the Obama White House, this is a man that I think most believe tried to do good. The thing is, some of the things that he failed to do were the most consequential moments of his presidency. And what we saw is that a young senator who campaigned on a platform of ending mass surveillance, saying there will be no more warrantless wiretapping in the United States. That's not what we do. That's not who we are. Once he sat in the chair himself, did not extinguish the program. Rather, he extended and embraced it. President who said he was going to hold Bush-era officials to the account of the law and make sure that there was accountability for those who had engaged in war crimes, for those who had tortured, and then very quickly abandoned that. I'm not going to say why, because I don't know. I think that's something that he's going to have to answer to history. But I think our country has very much, experienced the consequences of those decisions.
NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, his new memoir, Permanent Record. Watch part 1 of our discussion with him on our website at democracynow.org, where Snowden condemns President Trump's mistreatment of the anonymous whistleblower who helped spur the Democrats' impeachment effort. The Department of Justice has also sued Edward Snowden for the royalties of the book. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karan, Hani Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.